Some people think destiny arrives with fireworks. Mine arrived 30,000 feet above the Atlantic with a screaming baby and a man whose eyes looked too cold to belong to anyone human. The cabin lights dimmed at exactly 11:47 p.m., washing the plane in that strange blue glow that makes exhausted people look ghost-like. My 5-year-old son had fallen asleep against my shoulder 20 minutes after takeoff, his tiny sneakers pressed against my thigh, one small hand still tangled in the sleeve of my sweater like he was afraid I might disappear if he let go. Honestly, I understood the feeling. I stared out the oval window beside us, watching the black sky swallow the wing of the airplane while the engines hummed beneath my feet like distant thunder. Denver was already behind us. So was the apartment. The marriage. The version of my life I'd spent 6 years pretending was normal. I tightened my grip on Noah's blanket and tried not to think about the voicemail waiting on my phone. "You can't run forever, Emily." My ex-husband had left that message 3 hours earlier. Calm voice. Calm enough to scare me more than yelling ever did. The flight attendant rolled a drink cart down the aisle, ice rattling softly inside silver trays, but before she reached our row, the scream started. Sharp. Piercing. The kind of cry that cut straight through bone. Every head in the cabin turned at once. Somewhere near first class, a baby wailed hard enough to make people physically flinch. Not fussy crying. Not tired crying. Panic. Pure panic. I glanced up automatically, the same way mothers always do when another child sounds hurt. The screaming didn't stop. 2 minutes passed. Then 5. The woman across the aisle muttered under her breath and shoved noise-canceling headphones over her ears. A businessman near the exit sighed dramatically. Someone pressed the attendant call button twice. The baby kept screaming. I could hear the strain in those tiny lungs. Hear the desperation breaking apart every breath. Noah stirred against me. "Mom," he whispered sleepily. "It's okay, baby." I kissed the top of his head. "Go back to sleep." But I couldn't relax. Because something about that cry felt wrong. I'd spent years around children. Daycare shifts. Pediatric volunteer work. Endless nights raising Noah mostly alone. You learn the difference between tantrums and fear. That baby wasn't being difficult. She was terrified. Another flight attendant hurried past us toward first class, her expression tight with stress. 10 seconds later she came back looking even worse. The screams only got louder. The plane suddenly jolted through turbulence, hard enough to shake the overhead bins. A few passengers gasped. The seatbelt sign flashed brighter above us. And then I heard a man's voice for the first time. Low. Controlled. Dangerous even through exhaustion. "Why won't she stop crying?" I couldn't see him from my seat, but something about the silence that followed made my skin prickle. The kind of silence people make around powerful men. Noah had fallen asleep again, warm and heavy against my side, but my eyes stayed fixed toward the front of the cabin while the screaming continued. 30 seconds later, another rough patch of turbulence hit. The baby suddenly choked mid-cry. Not stopped. Choked. My heart jumped straight into my throat. I unbuckled before I even realized I'd made the decision. The flight attendant near row 6 looked horrified. "Ma'am, you need to stay seated." But I was already moving down the aisle, one hand gripping the seats for balance while the aircraft trembled around us. Every instinct inside me screamed the same thing. That baby needed someone. And for some reason I still don't fully understand, I knew the people around her had no idea how to help. That's when I saw him. Tall. Dark suit. Cold gray eyes sharp enough to cut through steel. He sat beside the screaming little girl like a man completely unafraid of chaos, but the tightness in his jaw betrayed him. Power radiated off him in quiet waves. Expensive watch. Tailored coat folded beside him. 2 men built like bodyguards sitting across the aisle. But none of that was what stopped me. It was the look in his eyes when he glanced at the child. Helplessness. Real helplessness. And somehow that frightened me more than anything else on that plane. The little girl could not have been older than 3. Pale blonde curls stuck to her damp cheeks while tiny fists twisted desperately in the fabric of her blanket. Up close, the sound of her crying hit even harder, raw and exhausted, like her whole body had forgotten how to calm down. One of the flight attendants looked seconds away from tears herself. "We tried everything," she whispered as I approached. "Juice, cartoons, snacks, medicine. Nothing works." The man beside the child lifted his eyes to me slowly, and I suddenly understood why the entire front cabin felt so tense. He was not just wealthy. Wealthy men smiled too much. This man carried silence like a weapon. Cold gray eyes studied me with careful suspicion while turbulence rattled the cabin around us. "You should sit down," he said evenly. His voice was deep enough to feel in my chest. "The seatbelt sign is on." I glanced at the little girl again. Her breathing hitched sharply between sobs. She cannot catch her breath properly. The man's jaw tightened almost invisibly. "She is scared of flying." "No," I said softly. "She is overstimulated." One of the bodyguards shifted in his seat like he did not appreciate me correcting his boss, but I barely noticed him anymore. Years of motherhood had trained my brain to focus only on the child in front of me. The little girl suddenly kicked against the armrest, panic flooding her face again as the plane shook harder. Without thinking, I crouched beside her seat carefully. "Hey, sweetheart." Her cries cracked into tiny gasps. "Can I see your bunny?" She clutched the stuffed rabbit tighter but looked at me for half a second through wet lashes. That was enough. Children always tell you what they need if you know where to look. "Okay," I whispered. "You do not have to talk. We can just breathe together instead." I slowly placed my hand over my own chest. "Like this. In and out." The man beside her watched every movement I made with unnerving intensity. Protective. Alert. Dangerous. But underneath all of it, I could see exhaustion sitting behind his eyes like something permanent. I recognized that look too. Single parents develop a kind of radar for each other. The little girl's cries softened slightly. When I lowered my voice even more. "You know what my son does when he gets scared?" I nodded toward Noah sleeping back in row 18. "He counts lights." Her tiny breaths trembled. "1 light," I whispered, pointing toward the overhead panel. 2 lights. 3 lights. The cabin rattled again. She flinched hard. Instinctively, her hand grabbed mine. Warm. Tiny. Shaking. The entire row went silent. Even the bodyguards froze. The little girl stared at me while tears slid slowly down her cheeks, but for the first time since I left my seat, she stopped screaming. The man beside her exhaled quietly like he had been holding his breath for hours. "Lily," he said gently to the child. "You are okay." So that was her name. Lily looked up at him but kept holding onto my hand. Her lower lip still trembled, yet the panic had faded slightly from her eyes. "Do you have children?" he asked me after a long moment. "1." I glanced toward Noah again. 5 years old. Another pause settled between us while the engines hummed beneath the floor. Close up, the man looked even more intimidating. Dark hair brushed neatly away from his forehead. Expensive charcoal coat. A silver watch that probably cost more than my old Honda. But there was something else too. Grief. Not fresh grief. Older than that. The kind that settles into someone's bones permanently. Lily shifted suddenly and leaned toward me instead of him. I felt her small fingers curl tighter around mine. The flight attendant looked stunned. She usually does not let strangers near her. The man's eyes never left my face. Neither do I. Something about the way he said it sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold cabin air. Then Lily whispered the first words I had heard from her all night. Stay. For a second, nobody moved. Not the flight attendants. Not the men in dark suits across the aisle. Not even the businessmen 3 rows back who had been complaining loud enough for half the cabin to hear. Everything seemed to pause around the sound of that tiny voice. Stay. Lily's fingers tightened around mine like she had already decided I belonged there. I looked up instinctively at her father, expecting him to shut this down immediately. Men like him usually controlled every inch of the space around them. You could feel it in the way people watched his reactions before speaking. But instead of pulling his daughter away, he just studied me with those cold gray eyes that somehow looked even darker beneath the dim cabin lights. Lily, he said carefully, the lady has her own seat. The little girl shook her head hard enough to make fresh tears slip down her cheeks. No, her voice cracked. Stay. The turbulence eased slightly, but tension still hung over the cabin thick as smoke. I glanced back toward row 18 again. Noah was still asleep, curled beneath the airline blanket with his cheek pressed against the window. One of the flight attendants noticed immediately. I can keep an eye on your son for a few minutes if you want, she whispered softly. I hesitated. Every protective instinct inside me screamed not to leave him. But then Lily's breathing started picking up again, panic creeping back into those tiny shoulders, and something in my chest twisted painfully. I knew that look. Children who feel abandoned always wear the same expression. Carefully, I slid into the empty seat across from Lily instead. Only until she calms down, I said quietly. The man nodded once. Thank you. Strange how 2 simple words sounded unfamiliar coming from someone like him. Like gratitude was not something he offered often. Up close, I noticed details I had missed before. A faint silver scar near his wrist disappearing beneath the cuff of his tailored shirt. Dark circles under his eyes hidden beneath composure. The kind of exhaustion no amount of money fixes. Lily slowly climbed out of her seat and into mine beside me without asking permission from either of us. She curled against my side instantly, still clutching the stuffed rabbit in one hand and my sweater in the other. Her tiny heartbeat fluttered against my arm like trapped wings. She likes you, one of the bodyguards muttered, sounding genuinely confused. The man beside us remained silent for several seconds before finally speaking. She has not done that with anyone since her mother died. The words landed softly. Quietly. Somehow that made them hurt more. My chest tightened before I could stop it. I am sorry, I whispered. His jaw flexed once. So am I. Silence settled between us again, interrupted only by the steady drone of the engines overhead. Lily's breathing finally began to slow completely. I brushed damp curls away from her forehead gently. How old is she? 3. He watched every movement I made like he was memorizing it. And your son? 5. You travel alone with him often? I let out a tired laugh before I could stop myself. Single mothers do not always get backup. Something unreadable flickered across his face then. Not pity. Men like him probably did not pity anyone. Recognition maybe. Understanding. One of the bodyguards leaned toward him slightly. Mr. Blackwood, he murmured under his breath, you should rest while she is calm. Blackwood. The name hit something in the back of my memory immediately. News articles. Finance magazines. Real estate headlines. Adrian Blackwood. Billionaire investor. Private security firms. Rumors nobody ever explained clearly. My stomach tightened. Suddenly the expensive suit and armed-looking security made a lot more sense. Adrian noticed the exact second recognition crossed my face. That expression usually means someone Googled me before. I swallowed hard. I did not need to. The corner of his mouth almost moved. Almost. Probably smarter that way. Lily shifted sleepily against me, then whispered something so softly I barely caught it. Sing. I blinked. What? Her tiny fingers curled tighter around my sleeve. Please. Adrian's eyes lifted slowly toward mine again. And for the first time since I walked into first class, the dangerous man in front of me looked uncertain. For some reason, that tiny request hit the entire row harder than the screaming had. Sing. Lily looked up at me with swollen eyes and trembling lashes while the cabin lights painted soft shadows across her pale cheeks. Children only ask for songs from people they trust. I learned that when Noah was a baby waking from nightmares after his father slammed doors loud enough to shake our apartment walls. Singing had become survival for us. A way to make fear smaller. I glanced at Adrian uncertainly. I do not exactly have a great voice. Neither do I, he said quietly. The honesty in his tone surprised me. Men like him usually sounded polished even when breathing. Lily tugged lightly on my sleeve again. Please. I swallowed the lump in my throat and brushed my fingers gently through her curls. Then I started singing the only lullaby I had ever really known. Softly. Barely above the hum of the engines. You are my sunshine, my only sunshine, the words felt fragile in the dark cabin. Familiar. Warm. Noah used to ask for that song every single night when he was little enough to fit against my chest. Lily's breathing slowed almost immediately. Her tiny body relaxed inch by inch against my side while I kept my voice low and steady. Across from us, both bodyguards had gone completely silent. One of the flight attendants stopped pretending to organize cups just to listen. But Adrian Blackwood looked like someone had pulled the ground out from underneath him. His eyes locked onto me with an expression I could not understand at first. Not anger. Not suspicion. Something deeper. Something painful. What? I asked softly when the silence stretched too long. His throat moved once before he answered. Her mother used to sing that exact song. Goosebumps raced down my arms instantly. Lily's small fingers curled tighter into my sweater while her eyes finally drifted closed. Adrian stared at his daughter for several seconds before speaking again. She has not slept on a flight since the funeral. The word funeral settled heavily between us. Suddenly everything made terrible sense. The panic. The exhaustion in his face. The helplessness hidden beneath all that control. Grief changes children in quiet ways adults rarely notice until it is too late. How long ago? I asked carefully. 8 months. His voice turned distant. Controlled too tightly. Car accident. I nodded slowly, though something about the way he said it made me think the story was more complicated than headlines probably knew. Men surrounded by security and silence rarely had simple lives. Lily shifted sleepily against me, and without thinking, I adjusted the blanket around her shoulders the same way I always did for Noah. Adrian watched that too. Every tiny movement. Like he had forgotten what gentleness looked like until now. You are very good with her, he said finally. I am just a mom. No, his eyes lifted to mine again. Sharp. Heavy. That is not all this is. My heartbeat stumbled unexpectedly. Dangerous men should not look at people that intensely. It felt too much like standing too close to fire. I glanced away first toward the dark airplane windows. She needed comfort. Most people avoid uncomfortable things. His tone carried no judgment. Just observation. You walked toward it. Before I could answer, Noah suddenly appeared at the edge of first class, rubbing sleep from his eyes with one tiny fist. Panic flashed across his face when he realized I was gone. Mom. I stood immediately, careful not to wake Lily too abruptly. Hey, baby. Noah hurried toward me in mismatched dinosaur socks, stopping short when he noticed Adrian and the security around him. His small hand wrapped tightly around mine. I woke up and you were gone. Guilt twisted sharply in my chest. I am sorry. I was helping her. Noah looked at Lily sleeping against my side, then back at me. Children understand more than adults give them credit for. She was scared, he whispered. Yeah. His expression softened instantly. Oh. Adrian watched the interaction silently while Noah climbed carefully into the seat beside me. Within seconds, Lily sleepily leaned her head against Noah's shoulder too. My son froze in surprise before whispering proudly, "Mom, she likes me." And for the first time all night, I saw Adrian Blackwood smile. The smile changed his entire face. Not completely. Adrian Blackwood still looked dangerous enough to make most people cross the street to avoid him. But for one brief second, the coldness cracked. And underneath it, I caught a glimpse of the man Lily probably remembered before grief hollowed him out. Noah noticed it too. Children always notice who is safe before adults do. My son relaxed slightly in his seat and looked proudly at Lily sleeping against him like he had just accomplished something important. She stopped crying, he whispered to me. You helped, I whispered back. Noah beamed. Adrian watched us quietly, one hand resting against his jaw while the cabin lights painted silver shadows across his face. There was something strangely intimate about the moment. Not romantic. Not yet. Just fragile. For strangers suspended somewhere above the clouds pretending the world below us was not waiting. One of the flight attendants approached carefully with fresh blankets and lowered her voice. Mr. Blackwood, the captain said we should hit smoother air in about 20 minutes. Adrian nodded once. Thank you. The woman smiled nervously before hurrying away like standing too close to him too long might be dangerous. I understood the feeling. Even sitting across from him now, calm and exhausted and strangely human, I could still sense the power wrapped around him like another layer of clothing. Men obeyed him instantly. Flight attendants whispered his name. Security watched every corner of the cabin. Yet none of that mattered to Lily. To her, he was just daddy. A tired father who looked helpless when his little girl cried. Can I ask you something? Adrian said suddenly. His voice stayed low enough not to wake the children. Depends what it is. The corner of his mouth almost moved again. Fair answer. He leaned back slightly in his seat, studying me with that unnervingly focused attention. Why are you really going to New York? My stomach tightened immediately. There it was. The question I had spent the entire flight avoiding from strangers. I glanced toward the dark windows instead of answering. Fresh start. Adrian did not blink. People running toward something say it differently than people running away. Heat crawled up my neck. You always analyze strangers on airplanes. Only the ones my daughter trusts instantly. The honesty in his tone caught me off guard again. I looked down at Noah sleeping beside Lily, their heads leaned together beneath the blankets like they had known each other longer than 2 hours. Something painful squeezed inside my chest unexpectedly. Because my son had not looked this peaceful in months. Maybe years. My ex-husband does not like losing control, I admitted quietly before I could stop myself. Adrian's expression changed instantly. Not dramatic. Subtle. But the temperature around him seemed to drop anyway. Control over what? Everything. The word came out sharper than I intended. I rubbed my thumb against Noah's small hand unconsciously. Where I worked. Who I talked to. What I wore. How late I stayed out. Whether I smiled enough. Adrian stayed completely still. Too still. And now. I swallowed hard. Now I left. Silence stretched between us again while the engines droned steadily beneath the cabin floor. Somewhere farther back, someone laughed softly. Ice clinked inside a glass. Normal airplane sounds. But suddenly my chest felt too tight for breathing. Adrian finally spoke. Does he know where you are going? No, I forced a smile that probably looked more tired than convincing. At least I hope not. Adrian's eyes held mine for several seconds too long. Then he glanced toward one of the bodyguards across the aisle. A silent communication passed between them instantly. The guard reached into his jacket, pulled out a phone, and typed something quickly before slipping it away again. Every protective instinct inside me sharpened. What was that? Adrian looked back at me calmly. Insurance. I do not need protecting. His gaze dropped briefly toward the fading yellow bruise near my wrist that I had forgotten to hide beneath my sleeve. Shame burned through me instantly. Adrian's jaw tightened almost invisibly. That bruise says otherwise. I pulled my sleeve down quickly. It is nothing. Emily. The way he said my name felt dangerous in a completely different way now. Softer. Controlled. Certain. Women only call bruises nothing when someone taught them they were not allowed to call them what they really are. My throat closed unexpectedly. For a second, I could not answer at all. Then Lily shifted sleepily against Noah and whispered one tiny word into the quiet cabin. Mama. Adrian closed his eyes. The sound of that word shattered something inside the cabin. Mama. Lily said it softly in her sleep, barely more than a breath against Noah's shoulder, but Adrian reacted like someone had pressed against a wound that never healed correctly. His eyes stayed closed for one long second before he finally looked away toward the dark airplane window beside him. Outside, the clouds stretched endlessly beneath the moonlight like frozen waves. She still does that sometimes, he said quietly. Calls for her mother when she wakes up scared. I did not know what to say to that. There are some kinds of pain that feel disrespectful to touch with words. Noah shifted sleepily beside Lily, his tiny hand still wrapped protectively around the stuffed rabbit she had dropped against his lap. Looking at them together hurt in a strange way too. Children adapt so quickly to kindness. Faster than adults ever do. Adrian leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms against his knees while exhaustion pulled at the sharp edges of his face. You should probably get your son back to your row before the crew starts questioning why 2 children disappeared into first class. His voice sounded steadier again. Controlled. Like he had shoved every emotion back behind locked doors. I nodded slowly but did not stand immediately. Part of me did not want to move. Which was ridiculous. This was a stranger. A dangerously powerful stranger whose name probably appeared in newspapers beside words like billionaire and investigation and influence. Yet somehow this tiny pocket of quiet 30,000 feet above the ocean felt safer than my apartment back in Denver ever had. Can I ask you something? I said softly. Adrian's eyes lifted back toward mine instantly. Alert again. You already did. I almost smiled despite myself. Fair enough. He leaned back slightly. Ask anyway. I hesitated before speaking. Why were you traveling alone with Lily? Something flickered across his face too quickly to fully read. I was not supposed to be. The answer settled heavily between us. Her nanny quit yesterday. Why? His expression turned colder instantly. She was afraid. Goosebumps crawled slowly across my arms. Of you? Adrian looked directly at me for several silent seconds before answering. Most people are. There was no arrogance in the statement. That was the unsettling part. He sounded like a man discussing the weather. Simple fact. Nothing emotional attached to it anymore. I studied him carefully then. The expensive clothes. The security. The dangerous stillness sitting beneath every movement. Yet Lily had curled instinctively toward him every time turbulence hit. Fearful children do not trust cruel people that way. I do not think your daughter is afraid of you, I said quietly. Adrian's jaw tightened almost invisibly. No, his voice lowered. She is afraid of losing me too. The honesty of that hit harder than I expected. Before I could respond, the plane suddenly jolted again through rough air. Hard enough that several passengers gasped from farther back in the cabin. Noah startled awake instantly while Lily whimpered in her sleep. Both children grabbed for us at the exact same moment. Noah clung to my arm. Lily reached blindly for Adrian's hand. And for one strange second, we looked like a family. The thought hit me so unexpectedly it almost stole my breath. Adrian noticed it too. I could tell by the way his eyes met mine across the dim cabin. Something changed there. Softer now. More dangerous somehow because of it. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom announcing another hour until landing in New York. 1 hour. Then this strange little world we accidentally built between rows 1 and 18 would disappear forever. The realization settled painfully inside my chest before I could stop it. Adrian glanced toward the bruise still barely visible beneath my sleeve again. When you land, he said quietly, where are you staying? Every protective instinct inside me sharpened immediately. Why? Because if a man spent years teaching you to flinch, Adrian said calmly, I do not like the idea of you walking into New York alone. My throat tightened unexpectedly. Nobody had ever said something like that to me before. Not without wanting something in return. You do not even know me. Adrian looked at Noah. Then Lily. Then finally back at me. I know enough. The closer we got to New York, the quieter the cabin became. Most passengers had fallen asleep beneath dim reading lights and half-finished drinks, but I could not relax anymore. Adrian's words kept replaying inside my head. I know enough. Dangerous men were not supposed to sound protective. They were supposed to sound controlling. Calculating. Like my ex-husband did whenever he apologized after making me cry. But Adrian Blackwood never once asked me to trust him. Somehow that made him harder to fear. Noah eventually climbed back into my lap while Lily remained curled beside Adrian beneath a cashmere blanket one of the flight attendants had brought earlier. She looked peaceful now. Finally peaceful. Adrian noticed me watching her. She has not slept this deeply in months. His voice stayed low enough not to wake either child. Nightmares? I asked softly. He nodded once. Every night. Something inside my chest ached unexpectedly. What about you? The question slipped out before I could stop it. Adrian looked mildly surprised. What about me? Do you sleep? A faint shadow crossed his face. Not much. Because of Lily? Because when you lose someone suddenly, he said quietly, your brain starts believing bad things happen whenever you close your eyes. The honesty of it caught me off guard again. Men with power usually hide weakness like it might kill them. Adrian spoke about grief like he had grown tired of pretending it was not there. I glanced toward the window where the first faint glow of New York shimmered far below the clouds. Tiny lights stretching endlessly into darkness. A whole city waiting beneath us. You still did not answer my question, Adrian said after a moment. Where are you staying? I hesitated. Truth felt embarrassing suddenly. A motel in Queens for a few days. One of the bodyguards looked up immediately from across the aisle. Adrian stayed completely expressionless. Which somehow felt worse. What? I asked defensively. It was cheap. Emily. He said my name slowly like he was trying not to lose patience. You are arriving in New York at nearly 3 in the morning with a child. I have handled worse. That does not mean you should keep having to. My throat tightened unexpectedly. I looked away before he could see it affect me. Nobody had ever spoken to me like Being exhausted was not simply my permanent responsibility. You barely know me, I whispered again. Adrian studied me for several long seconds. I know your son checks your face before he speaks. My breath caught instantly. What? Every time Noah talks, Adrian said quietly, he watches your expression first. Shame rushed through me so fast it almost burned. Because he was right. Noah did that constantly. Children raised around tension learn to read moods before words. Adrian glanced toward my sleeping son. That behavior does not appear overnight. I swallowed hard against the sudden pressure in my chest. You notice too much. That is how I kept my daughter alive after her mother died. The bluntness of the statement silenced me completely. Adrian leaned back slightly in his seat again while the engines hummed steadily around us. You are not the only parent on this plane trying to outrun fear. Something dangerous shifted inside me then. Not attraction exactly. Trust maybe. Which felt even riskier. The captain announced our descent into New York, and immediately the cabin began waking around us. Seatbelts clicked. Window shades lifted. Flight attendants moved briskly through the aisles preparing for landing. Reality rushed back too fast. This strange fragile connection built somewhere over the Atlantic suddenly had an expiration date. Lily stirred sleepily beside Adrian, blinking up at him with confusion before spotting me. Emily. My heart squeezed painfully at the sound of my name in her tiny voice. Adrian brushed a hand gently over her hair. We are landing, sweetheart. She frowned immediately. No, Noah yawned beside me. Can we stay on the airplane? Adrian's mouth almost curved again while exhaustion softened his face. Unfortunately, that is not how airplanes work. The wheels lowered beneath us with a distant mechanical groan. New York glittered outside the windows now. Huge. Cold. Waiting. Adrian looked at me one final time before the plane touched down. When we land, he said quietly, do not leave the airport alone. The moment the plane touched the runway, reality returned all at once. Phones lit up across the cabin. Seatbelts unclicked. Overhead bins slammed open while tired passengers rushed to reclaim their normal lives. But my chest tightened harder with every passing second because outside those airport windows was New York. And somewhere beyond New York was the man I had spent 2 years trying not to provoke. Noah rubbed sleep from his eyes while I helped him back into his sneakers. Lily still sat beside Adrian clutching the stuffed rabbit in one hand and the sleeve of his jacket in the other. She looked calmer now. Softer somehow. Like the screaming little girl from 4 hours earlier had finally disappeared. Adrian stood as soon as the plane reached the gate, immediately towering over everyone around him. The bodyguards moved automatically too, creating quiet space around him without saying a word. People noticed. They always noticed men like Adrian Blackwood. Flight attendants straightened nervously. Passengers stepped aside instinctively. Power has its own gravity. Stay close, Adrian told Lily gently while reaching for their bags. Then his eyes lifted to me. That applies to you too. I opened my mouth to argue automatically, but before I could speak, my phone vibrated sharply inside my coat pocket. My stomach dropped instantly. Because only one person still called that number repeatedly. I stared at the screen without breathing. 7 missed calls. 3 voicemails. 1 text message. Where are you? The blood drained from my face so fast Noah noticed immediately. Mom, he whispered softly. Adrian saw it too. Of course he did. Men like him probably survived by noticing fear before it became visible. Emily. His voice lowered dangerously. What happened? I locked the screen quickly. Nothing. Adrian did not move. Look at me. Something in his tone made my pulse stumble. Calm. Controlled. But impossible to ignore. Slowly, I lifted my eyes toward his. Adrian studied my face for maybe 2 seconds before holding out one large hand silently. Phone. Absolutely not. Emily. His expression hardened slightly. If a man has you shaking from a text message, then it stopped being private a long time ago. I hated that part of me wanted to cry hearing someone say that out loud. Because deep down, I knew he was right. My fingers trembled slightly as I handed him the phone before I could change my mind. Adrian glanced at the screen once. Just once. But the entire atmosphere around him shifted instantly afterward. The coldness returned. Sharp and terrifying now beneath the polished surface. One of the bodyguards noticed immediately and straightened near the aisle. Adrian typed something quickly into his own phone before giving mine back. What did you do? I asked quietly. Prepared. Prepared for what? Adrian's gray eyes locked onto mine with unsettling calm. For the possibility that your ex-husband already knows you landed. Fear crawled coldly down my spine. That is impossible. Adrian said nothing. Which somehow scared me more. The airport doors finally opened, releasing a rush of cold New York air into the jet bridge. Passengers filed out around us carrying coffee cups and backpacks and ordinary problems while my heartbeat hammered painfully against my ribs. Noah reached for my hand automatically. Mom, he whispered again. I forced myself to smile down at him. I am okay, baby. But I was lying. Adrian took Lily into his arms carefully as she rested sleepily against his shoulder. Then he looked back at me one more time. You said you booked a motel in Queens. I nodded slowly. Cancel it. I cannot just stay with a stranger. Adrian stepped closer then. Not threatening. Somehow worse than threatening because he did not need intimidation to command attention. Emily, he said quietly, the second you walked onto this plane tonight, you stopped being alone. My breath caught unexpectedly. Behind him, one of the bodyguards suddenly touched his earpiece and stiffened. Sir, he murmured carefully, we may have a problem. Adrian's eyes never left mine. I know. Everything after that happened too fast. 1 second we were standing inside the narrow jet bridge surrounded by sleepy passengers dragging roller bags behind them. The next, Adrian's entire security team shifted around us like a wall closing into place. Not aggressive. Protective. The difference mattered more than people realized. Noah pressed closer against my side immediately. Sensing tension the same way children sense storms before adults notice clouds. Mom, he whispered nervously. It is okay, baby. I forced calm into my voice even though my pulse had started pounding hard enough to hurt. Adrian looked toward the bodyguard beside him. Talk to me. The man lowered his voice. We spotted someone waiting near baggage claim asking airport staff about a woman traveling with a little boy. Ice flooded my stomach instantly. No, the word slipped out before I could stop it. Adrian's eyes snapped toward me immediately. Emily. I shook my head too fast. He cannot be here. But deep down, I already knew. My ex-husband always found things eventually. Lost keys. Deleted messages. Passwords. Me. That was the worst part about men obsessed with control. They treated leaving like a temporary inconvenience instead of a decision. Adrian stepped closer without hesitation, lowering his voice so only I could hear. Does he know what Noah looks like? Shame burned through me instantly. Yes. Adrian nodded once like he had expected that answer. Calm. Focused. Dangerous in the most terrifyingly controlled way. Then you are not going to baggage claim. My suitcase is down there. Emily. His tone sharpened slightly. Your suitcase is replaceable. Nobody had ever spoken to me like my safety mattered more than my belongings before. The realization almost broke something open inside my chest. Lily stirred sleepily against Adrian's shoulder and blinked at me with confused eyes. "What happened?" she whispered. Adrian's entire expression softened instantly when he looked at her. "Nothing you need to worry about, sweetheart." Then he turned back toward me. "Can Noah walk?" I nodded quickly. "Yes." "Good." One of the bodyguards stepped forward immediately. "The private exit is clear." Private exit. Of course, men like Adrian Blackwood had private exits inside airports. Around us, passengers kept moving normally toward baggage claim, completely unaware my entire future had suddenly tilted sideways in less than 60 seconds. Adrian guided us down a separate hallway away from the main terminal, one hand resting lightly against Lily's back while security surrounded us with quiet precision. Noah held my hand tightly enough to hurt. "Mom," he whispered carefully, "is Dad here?" My throat closed instantly. Children should never sound afraid saying the word Dad. Adrian heard it too. I saw the exact moment something cold settled permanently into his expression. "Noah," I said softly, crouching slightly beside him while we walked, "you stay close to me, okay?" He nodded immediately. Adrian watched the interaction silently for several seconds before speaking. "How long has your son been afraid of him?" I looked away first. "Long enough." Adrian's jaw tightened. "That answer tells me everything I need to know." The hallway finally opened into a private underground garage where 3 black SUVs waited beneath fluorescent lights. Rain hammered faintly somewhere outside. New York in the middle of the night smelled like wet concrete and cold air drifting through open loading doors. Adrian opened the back door of the nearest SUV himself. "Get in." "Adrian, no arguments." His gray eyes locked onto mine with calm certainty. "Not tonight." I should have refused. Every survival instinct I had built over years should have screamed at me not to trust powerful strangers offering protection too easily. But then Noah climbed into the SUV without hesitation because children know safety long before adults admit they need it. Lily reached sleepily toward me from Adrian's arms. And Adrian himself looked at me like a man who had already decided nobody was touching the fragile little world we accidentally built on that airplane. "You said I stopped being alone tonight," I whispered softly. Adrian held my gaze for one long second while rain echoed through the dark garage around us. "No," he said quietly. "I said nobody is going to make you afraid again."